Welcome to another episode of Pepper's Pages. Today we're going to be going over my 2021 reads for March. Just a little warning ahead of time, some of these books that I'll be describing are a little graphic. I won't go super into detail because it's really not necessary. And also there might be a few spoilers, mostly because it's a little hard for me to really talk about how I feel about them without going into details. So I will do my best to put timestamps in the description. That way if you want to skip to the next book and not know anything else about what I'm talking about at the time, you are more than welcome to do that. First up we have 8 Perfect Murders by Peter Swanson. This follows Malcolm Kershaw, who co-owns a quaint little bookstore in Boston called Old Devil's Bookstore, where he spends his time writing reviews about different books and helping their customers look through the crime section. In the beginning of this book, he is approached by an FBI agent who is investigating a series of murders that just so happen to coincide with a list that he compiled and posted on the company's blog, which he believes to be the best crime books written. Together, they start hunting down the perpetrator, and slowly, Malcolm starts to think that the person committing these crimes is trying to send him a message. This is told through first-person narrative as Malcolm tries to convince you that this is a true story and that he is innocent of having anything to do with these murders. You learn that his wife, several years before, died in a car crash as she was driving home drunk, and he portrays himself as this lonely widower that lives an exceptionally quiet life and really only has one friend outside of work. I personally enjoyed the concept for this book, but I was a little disappointed that it does spoil a whole lot of the books that are mentioned in it. I am usually not one to get upset about a story being spoiled because it's more about the experience for myself, but I do know there are a lot of people out there who enjoy the thrill of reading things through for the first time. With that being said, I'm going to list off the 8 books that are mentioned in this, and if there are any of them that you want to read for yourself for the first time, I recommend that you check those out first before you pick up this book. So the following books are included in Malcolm's blog: The ABC Murders by Agatha Christie, Strangers on a Train by Patricia Highsmith, Death Trap by Ira Levin, Red House Mystery by A.A. Milne, Malice Aforethought by Anthony Berkeley Cox, Double Enmity by James M. McCain, The Drowner by John D. MacDonald, and A Secret History by Donna Tartt. Malcolm spends most of the book trying to figure out who it is that's trying to pin him for these murders and help the FBI agent figure it out as well. But he keeps a lot of things hidden, not only from her, but from us. I had an idea from the beginning that he would end up being involved with this in some way or another, whether he was completely innocent of the murders that were happening at this period of time or if it had to do with something in the past. But Swanson tries very, very hard to keep you off of that trail, and he kind of mixes things up, which gets a little frustrating in the end, but we'll get there. From the beginning, you get this feeling that he is a very unreliable narrator, and there comes a point in the story where it hits and you're just like, oh my gosh, I honestly feel like this guy's keeping something from me. This is the point where I'm probably going to spoil a lot of things for this book, so if you're interested in reading it, I suggest that you skip ahead or go to the next book. When Malcolm starts thinking about the book Strangers on a Train, I immediately knew that it was going to have some sort of significance to everything that was going on, and if you know what the story is beforehand, it will absolutely give away the whole ending. Honestly, I think that Swanson was kind of banking on the fact that a lot of people have never read these books. So even though Malcolm convinces you that he really only has one friend in this world, he does happen to have a very famous author that he is pals with, and he goes to visit him one night at the end of the book. Here he turns down a rather risque relationship offer from the author's wife, and when she falls asleep, Malcolm is attacked by the person who is after him this entire time. This is the point in the story where we learn that Malcolm made a deal with a stranger online for a hit that he personally could not bring himself to do. So this person has tracked him down and figured out who he is and is trying to get his attention this entire story. I was a little frustrated learning this in the end because there are things that Malcolm does and says that don't exactly line up as you go through the story. It didn't ruin it, but it was just kind of aggravating to me in a way. So Swanson is obviously trying to build up this big twist in the end. He actually ends up having several throughout the entire story. But to me, it would have been really interesting to learn about this agreement at the beginning of the book to add more to Malcolm's character. You didn't necessarily need to think that he was this innocent person the whole time. It kind of was a little lackluster because of this, in my opinion. I think it would have been way more interesting to watch Malcolm admit to the audience what he has done and go through the entire story trying to convince this FBI agent that he has nothing to do with it and is trying to cover it up along the way. In trying to get you off of Malcolm's trail, I feel like it lost a lot of its intensity, mostly because when you go back and look at the actions he has taken and the thoughts that he has, it really just gets a little muddled and some of them really don't make sense. Overall, this was a pretty decent book. I enjoyed reading it. There were a few times where I found myself being a little bored with the story, but all in all, I thought it was an interesting concept. I liked the thought of using old books to build up a whole new crime story. Our character just works a little too hard trying to contain his truth and also try to solve this mystery at the same time when he could have outwardly said something and spent more time trying to hide it from the FBI agent. It just seemed like a little bit too much to me. So next up we have The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. This book is honestly one of my new favorites. It was a fantastic read and I've been very excited to talk about this one. This book follows the lives of 4 American Indian friends, Lewis, Ricky, Gabe, and Cass, after a hunting trip leaves them with a very dark secret. Near the 10-year anniversary of this dreaded event, they find themselves facing the very thing that they destroy the life of to begin with: a humanoid female elk. You might laugh at this because it does seem a little cheesy in the thought of it, but honestly, the imagery in this book was absolutely terrifying and gave me a few nightmares. I loved the underlying themes for this book. They were honestly something that haven't been spoken on that I've read myself up until the last year or so. The most important ones that I will touch on today are the importance of accepting your inheritance and coming to terms with where you came from, as well as the way that grief, greed, and vengeance can affect not only your life, but those around you. Some characters are absolutely desperate to leave the reservation, while others are successful and end up living with this resentment the rest of their life because of it. We are immediately thrust into this book by losing one of our main characters during a bar fight that is moved outside, and the last thing he sees is a pack of elk. From here, we transition into our first main character to be focused on, and that is Lewis. Lewis lives a very peaceful and quiet life with his wife, and everything is going great. They find out they are pregnant, and things turn on its head when a fellow coworker starts hanging around, obviously trying to get into Lewis's pants. By being incredibly nosy, this coworker sets the full story into motion by pretty much forcing Lewis to admit to what he and his friends have done. This revelation tips him into insanity, and he begins seeing in the shadow of an elk woman, and from there he loses his mind and commits an unforgivable act that he must work to hide. This story was so unpredictable from the very beginning, and I was hooked from this moment forward. Honestly, it was just such a ride. After losing Lewis, we are giving the perspective of the Ponoka elk spirit as she traverses through the world trying to find the rest of the clan. And it seems like that might be kind of weird to get, but honestly, it was just, it added so much to the book getting to see this side of the horror aspect of it. The story then shifts to our next character, Cass, who still lives on the reservation with his fiancée. He has an ex-wife and a daughter that he has a very strained relationship with. The focal point in the story for these characters at the time of meeting them is that they are preparing a sweat lodge session for the sheriff's son. During this, the Ponoka spirit interferes with their plans and causes a very brutal fight between Cass and Gabe that I absolutely was not expecting. The entire scene with the sweat lodge, I kept forgetting to breathe because one thing after another keeps happening that you really don't expect, and it is just so wild that you can't even catch up with it for a minute. I had to put it down and kind of process what I was reading. As much as I would love to talk about more and my feelings on it, this book is really worth not knowing anything about it because there's just a lot in not knowing what's going to happen next because anything could happen. I absolutely loved the ending of this book and how the last character standing went about winning. You don't expect this character to be the last one alive, and you definitely don't see them being the one to end this curse. Most people found it to be a little anticlimactic, but I personally found it to be a very beautiful choice because sometimes the only way you can end this type of vengeance and pain is with kindness and compassion and showing some sort of love towards the being or person that is wreaking havoc on everyone. Most people found this to be pretty anticlimactic, but I thought that Jones's choice and how he ended the curse was a beautiful solution. Sometimes anger and resentment can be healed with just a little bit of compassion and understanding. The entire ending sequence had me on edge. I was able to picture fully what it was like for our final character to see the Ponoka spirit following them down the road and its head just appearing up over the grass as it came up over a hill. It just was seriously heart-pounding. This spirit toys with our final character to the point that it is just unbearable, and the tension created in it was just immaculate in my opinion. I highly recommend those who enjoy horror pick up this book, but I suggest that you look into the reviews for this because it is very mixed. Some people didn't enjoy the tone or the themes behind it and kind of found the folklore-y pieces of it to be a little too cheesy, while others said that they couldn't put this book down for anything. I will warn you that there is some animal violence in this. It is nothing absolutely drastic, but it is hard to read. For me personally, the way Jones took this and created his own traditional storytelling really felt like something that an elder in a tribe or on the reservation would tell a little kid just to spook them. No! Okay, well I guess that's where all my books are going. Next on our list is this monster, 11/22/63 by Stephen King. Jake Epping is your average high school teacher in the modern world who dreams of writing a book one day but just hasn't got around to doing it yet. His life is lonely and seems as though it will never change until an old man who owns a diner down the road named Al gives him a call and asks him a favor. Soon he is thrust into the past where he struggles to keep his promise to the old man, saving President Kennedy. From the time he steps through the rabbit hole, Jake, or known as George in the past, learns about selflessness, love, and determination. In my opinion, this is one of Stephen King's weakest stories. He's really known for how dense his books are, and most of them are really filled with useless information. They're more trying to build a world that doesn't need all of the information that you're given. It also doesn't help that I finished reading this just as I started questioning my loyalty to Stephen King, but I will touch on that in another video. The concept for this book was neat. I enjoy stories about time travel, and I really think that the inside cover of this that shows John F. Kennedy surviving was really what hooked me, because that was kind of a shock to open up and be like, whoa, you know, in a world where he had lived, what would things be like now? But honestly, there is just so much crammed into this book that it lost my attention. It took me 2 copies of this book. I originally had several bookmarkers in this one and the other one that I am going to sell because I don't need 2 copies of this. And finally I gave in and decided to read the Audible. Over 19 hours later, I got it finished, and this is where we're at now. So even though there's a lot of useless information and things that you don't really need to know about for this story, there were parts that I really enjoyed about this book. The biggest one happens earlier on in the story, where Jake has to go to Derry, Maine, where the book It is placed, and you get a lot of fan servicey stuff from that book, as well as the story of the janitor that works in his school from the modern times. One of the nights where he is successful in saving Harry and his family, he finds himself in the very middle of the situation. It is a brutal scene that you have to read through, but it is so interesting because you already know about Harry and his character and feel bad for the way that he has to live in the future. And getting to watch Jake try and save this family and end up succeeding is like the best feeling. I kind of think that this section alone would have been a great book on its own. It was just really engaging and you wanted to see these characters survive, and I felt very panicky when George, or Jake, started finding himself being pushed by the past to stay away from this because the past doesn't want to change. From here, Jake goes out and finds different points in time that he tries to change in order to test things out before he really sets off to start living his life in order to follow Oswald around and learn more about him and how he's going to stop him from killing the president. I did enjoy getting to learn about the places that I am familiar with that he calls back in this book. It's cool to see them from the past, but I could honestly look that up in a history book and get just about the same amount of knowledge out of it. This was the most boring part of the book. Watching Jake find apartment after apartment and follow this man around, listening through the walls, reading through the notes that Al has already created himself. I knew going into this that it wasn't going to be the most exciting thing, but I feel like it could have been a lot shorter. There's just so much packed into this that you just get bored after a while. Eventually he ends up in the small town of Jody, Texas, and lives out his life as a teacher there. And I wondered where this place was at for a long time because I've personally never heard of it before, and it turns out that Stephen King just kind of made it up, and that's fine. But in Jody, he falls in love with not only the people of this town, but a battered wife named Sadie. This isn't really a spoiler. I will not give away the ending of this book, even though it disappointed me so badly, but I really wish that Jake had at least taken Sadie to the future and either had to teach her about how they live life there. She could have gone crazy, she could have just turned to dust as soon as she walked through the rabbit hole, but we don't get anything like that. The biggest thing that I really wish had happened was that he chose to stay in the past with Sadie and Jody and just live out his life and forget everything that he was there to do to begin with, because the way that this book ends, it really feels like none of it was worth it and you just wasted all of your time reading through this. There is a bigger moral to this story, but to me the one I got was you can't change the past, and that's about it. I won't go into my reservations about King right now because I would like to talk about his books as a collective at some point, but this really made me not want to read anything by him in the future because it just felt so different from the things that he's written before. I do have several books that I would like to read by him, like Misery, and I have like a list of the ones that I know are safe to read. If you're a history buff, you'll probably like this story. I know a lot of people really enjoy the history of JFK and that entire thing. I mean, if you go to Dallas, they have tours for it and people are constantly going on them. But you do need to be prepared for an avalanche of details and boring filler throughout this entire book that just seemed like he was trying to write a very large novel about time travel, and for me there was no payoff in the end. Annihilation by Jeff VanderMeer follows the 12th expedition into Area X, a top secret plot of land that has left 11 other expeditions abandoned and their crews dead. 4 female scientists are sent in to figure out exactly what is happening and what has caused the anomaly to occur. Most people are familiar with the movie starring Natalie Portman. I adore that movie. I've watched it so many times, even before I knew the book was a thing. But in my opinion, the way the book holds the storytelling is just so much more terrifying. You're really able to get inside of this character's head and watch her and the others around her unravel as they try and traverse this strange dimension that is formed on our planet. There are several differences between the book and the movie that I thought were really great additions to the movie, but they're both wonderful in their own way. The only issue that I had while listening to this on Audible was how often I found myself dissociating, and it was mostly due to all the scientific explanations that were going on. They were absolutely necessary to the storytelling and the things happening in this story, so it's really on me for not being able to focus. I realized after reading the reviews for this book that I was not the only one who had trouble with this. Something interesting to me was that none of the characters in this were ever given names. Most of them just go by the titles of the jobs that they hold. And I think that maybe one character reveals her name, but I really can't remember. This was a pretty short book to get through, so it didn't take a whole lot of time. But so many horrifying things happen in this that while those things were happening, I was completely engrossed and focused on what was happening in the moment. Even if you haven't seen the movie, I recommend you watch that or pick up the book because it is a great sci-fi horror story that keeps you on the edge of your seat. Okay, so this next book is really going to be a doozy to try and explain to you, but I'm going to do the best that I can. This is Everville by Clive Barker. This opens with a group of settlers traveling, trying to find themselves a new home, and amongst them is a father and daughter who are well known amongst the group for daydreaming about their dream city that they would love to build together. This causes several people in the group to sneer at the idea and eventually leads to the demise of one of these characters, leading the other one to go forward and create the town Everville. After this, we switch to the present day time, and we are thrown into the middle of the story of these 2 lovers who are having an affair and end up getting caught by the husband of Phoebe. Both are chased away from each other and don't see one another again until honestly the end of the story, and they still technically don't see each other. There's not a lot in this where you actually see them. It's focused more around the other characters from the first book. Now, I've been searching for a Hellbound Heart for a very long time, and for some reason it's been very hard for me to find. And in my impatience to find this specific book, I decided to grab the first Clive Barker book that I saw and learned that it was a big mistake. At the time, I had no idea that this is the second book in the series called The Great and Secret Show, so there's a lot of information that I was missing, but I don't feel like you really need to have read the first one in order to understand what's happening in this one. There are many characters to keep up with this in this book, but all of them come together to cause a crack in the sky that opens up into the world or dimension of Quiddity. I honestly was kind of hooked into the story from the moment that they discussed the crack in the sky because it really reminded me of Matt Smith's Doctor Who. Most of his series revolves around a crack in the universe that he has to figure out how to close. This book is very graphic in a lot of different ways. It is very sexually explicit. There are a lot of descriptions of what the characters are doing, and I'm personally not one to read those types of books, but honestly it was overlookable and it didn't ruin the story. There are also a lot of very violent descriptions in this. The world is on the verge of ending. There are evil entities and beings coming in wreaking havoc everywhere, but anything that Tesla Bombeck did, in my opinion, was completely badass. There's a scene where she literally kicks the soul out of a demon, and I just lost my mind. I recommend picking up the first book because I've read that a lot of people enjoy The Great and Secret Show a lot better. You get a lot of the characters' backstories, Some people even said that this book was really boring compared to that one, and I did find this a little slow, but it definitely wasn't boring. If you decide to skip the first one, or if you've read it a long time ago and you don't remember, it's okay. I wasn't really lost throughout this whole thing. There were several characters I wish that I had had more background on, or that had been explained a little bit more, but that's on me for not looking up before I bought it. We are now to the last book of our discussion, and honestly my favorite one from this month. This is Bird Box by Josh Malerman. When unseen creatures take over the earth, a pregnant Mallory is forced to leave her own home and seek out another, which has a group of people living inside of it working together to survive. All goes well until the wrong person is invited inside to stay. This is told from two different storylines, the first one being Mallory as she is pregnant and trying to learn to live with these people, and the next is when her children are 4 years old and she is forced to leave the home that they've been in for so long in order to find a safer place to live. This place she's heard about is actually up the river, which is in her backyard, and she has to manage to get up that river completely blindfolded, and none of them are able to see what they are doing or where they were going. The reason that they are blindfolded and unable to see is because the creatures inhabiting the earth now, apparently if you look at them you become irate and suicidal. If you have seen this movie starring Sandra Bullock, please for a minute forget that it ever existed and let's discuss this book because it is honestly crazy. After hearing about the movie and all the mixed reviews that it had, I honestly didn't care about it until the moment that I saw the book in the bookstores and realized that it was an adaptation. Let me tell you, this book is so much better than the movie, and I am considering comparing the two in a future video. The concept of the creatures is very interesting but kind of daunting because the only way that you will ever get a full description of these things is if Mallory dies. Part of me was kind of concerned that Malerman would end up trying to describe the creature and it would just fall short of anything you can imagine in your head. This book focuses mainly around the fears that parents have in trying to raise children, and especially having to raise them in a dangerous world and having to do it alone. We know that this is not an impossible task to undertake, but I could not imagine how terrifying that would have to be to raise children alone in a world so terrifying. And even in ours today, because we have a very scary world. Malerman makes it very easy to put yourself in Mallory's shoes and feel her hopes that she has that one day her children can have a proper place to be raised and be safe to live in. She is hopelessly alone, and it is a really intense thing to try and picture for yourself. This is kind of a spoiler, but it's not one that's really going to ruin the book for you. But there is a point where Mallory has to consider blinding the children in her own way. I won't give that away. She last minute decides not to do it because she knows that the pain that it will put her children through, and thank God she ends up not going through with it. Though the situation will never be like this, parents every day have to make these sorts of decisions for their children and do what they know is best for those kids, even if it will cause them discomfort. My heart really, really broke for this character. I really enjoyed how well the housemates got along together. There was not really any issues that came up except for one character who's like really cranky, up until the point that they let the wrong person in. They each pulled their own weight and were caring enough to not only take in one, but two pregnant women. Part of me hoped that Tom and Mallory would end up getting together. Even though that doesn't happen, the subtlety of their actions towards each other and the way that Mallory cares for him was just wonderful. The tension in this book is just so high. Even when the characters are just sitting around, they're all incredibly bored. They don't know what to do, and there's nothing that they can do to help themselves get out of this situation. The housemates are seeing Mallory and the other woman that comes in as ticking time bombs. It would be horrifying to be in that situation and know that someone is about to bring life into it and not be able to keep this thing like absolutely safe. I will never understand why the movie strayed from the book so far, because it was honestly perfect the way that it was, and the movie just felt very rushed, and you don't really get a lot of the tension and build up, and you don't really get to know the characters the way that the book intended for it to be, and so you lose a lot of things through that. The birthing scene for the movie had a kind of a comedic tone to me, where the book, my heart was pounding the entire scene. This doesn't spoil anything really, but the birth scene in the book takes place on a very stormy night. They have no power in the house. It's raining like crazy outside, and you have two women going into labor at the exact same time. Things go downhill very, very quickly for all of these characters, and it was just a truly horrifying scene to witness. I couldn't imagine having to be any of these characters in this situation. I went into this book having very low expectations because of the reviews and the things that I've seen said about the movie, and I almost didn't pick it up because of that. This book was incredible on its own. It was written wonderfully. The storytelling was awesome. There really wasn't anything in this that I thought about later and felt like it was out of place. So whether you've seen the movie or not, I recommend that you pick up this book and give it a shot, because if they had wanted to do the movie any justice, they would have stuck to this book. So this concludes our 2021 March reads. I hope to have April's up next week. We'll see how that goes. If you have any opinions or thoughts on any of these books, please share them with me, because I would love to discuss them with you. If you have any book recommendations or something that you would like to see me review, let me know as well. Until next time, I hope you all have a great day and happy reading.